At 8 years old, I watched my entire world burn in the sky. The plane carrying my parents exploded over New York. And I didn't just lose them. I lost my name, my home, my future. Or at least, that's what my uncle thought. While the world pitied the little orphan girl crying at a funeral, he was signing papers, transferring bank accounts, selling cars, putting my mansion in his name. He didn't just steal my inheritance. He erased me. I remember the day he dropped me at the orphanage like unwanted luggage. No hug, no tears, just cold eyes and a forged smile. "Be strong, Angela," he said. And then he drove away in my father's car. For 17 years, I lived in a place where hope was rationed and dreams were a luxury. But pain does something strange to a child. It either breaks you, or it builds something dangerous. He thought I would grow up broken. He was wrong. Because while he was spending my money, living in my house, drinking wine from my father's cellar, I was studying, planning, watching. Now I'm 25. And today I walked into his office with documents that could destroy him. He stole my childhood. But I'm about to take everything. And this time, I won't leave him with an orphanage. I was 8 years old when the sky stole my parents. I remember the morning clearly because it felt ordinary. My mother braided my hair before school and told me she would call me from New York. My father lifted me in his arms and promised to bring back my favorite chocolate. "Be brave, Angela," he whispered, pressing his forehead to mine. I didn't know those words would become a permanent echo in my mind. That afternoon, the world changed in a single sentence. Plane crash, no survivors. I didn't understand what that meant at first. Adults were crying. Neighbors filled our house. Reporters stood outside like vultures. I kept waiting for someone to tell me it was a mistake. I kept waiting for the door to open and for my parents to walk in smiling, apologizing for the confusion. But the door never opened. Instead, my uncle arrived, my father's younger brother. He hugged me tightly at the funeral, and everyone praised him for stepping up. "You're lucky to have him," they said. Lucky, I didn't know luck could feel so cold. In the days after the funeral, I sat quietly at the long dining table while lawyers discussed things I couldn't comprehend: trust funds, guardianship, estate management. My parents had built a life of security for me. The house, the cars, the company shares, the bank accounts. Everything was placed in a trust until I turned 25. I was protected. At least that's what my parents believed. But protection only works when the guardian has a conscience. 2 weeks later, my uncle told me we were going for a drive. I thought we were going home. Instead, we stopped, in front of iron gates that creaked like they were warning me. St. Mary's Children. Home. I remember gripping his hand tighter, confused. He knelt in front of me with a rehearsed sadness in his eyes. "This is temporary, Angela. Just until the legal matters settle." Legal matters. I didn't know those words would steal 17 years of my life. He signed papers quickly. Too quickly, I watched his signature glide across documents that sealed my fate. When he stood up, I tugged on his jacket. "When are we going home?" I asked. He gently removed my hand like I was something fragile but inconvenient. "This is your home now," he said softly. Then he walked away. I stood by the window and watched him drive off in my father's black Mercedes. That was the last time he looked back at me as family. The orphanage smelled like bleach and broken dreams. The walls were pale, the beds were small, and the nights were long. Children cried into their pillows. Some screamed. Some fought. I chose silence. Silence became my survival. I observed everything. I noticed how the staff whispered when my uncle visited. I noticed how he never stayed long. He asked about documents, about my behavior, about signatures, not about me. Years passed like slow rain. Birthdays came and went without candles. I grew taller, quieter, stronger inside. When I turned 13, I began asking questions. Where is my house? What happened to my parents' company? The answers were always vague. Your uncle is handling everything. Handling. That word began to feel like theft disguised as responsibility. At 16, I found something that changed the way I saw the world. In a pile of donated magazines, I saw his face on the cover of a business publication. He was standing in front of my father's company building, smiling confidently. The headline read, "A visionary leader revives family enterprise." Revives. My father's company had never been dying. It was thriving. I read every word of that article. He claimed he stepped in during financial instability. He spoke of sacrifice and resilience. He painted himself as the hero of a story that wasn't his. That night, something inside me shifted. I stopped being the abandoned child. I became the girl who pays attention. I poured myself into education because I realized knowledge was the only inheritance he couldn't steal. I studied business law, finance, corporate governance. Every subject felt personal. Every lesson felt like uncovering a layer of his deception. I excelled not because I wanted praise, but because I wanted power the quiet. Undeniable power of understanding. When I turned 18, I requested access to my trust documentation. Legally, I had the right. The orphanage director hesitated, but eventually, the envelope arrived, thick, official, heavy with truth. I opened it with trembling hands. Transaction records, property transfers, executive authorizations. I didn't need a lawyer to see what had happened. Assets had been moved under temporary management authority, vehicles, sold and reacquired through subsidiary entities, funds withdrawn under operational expenses. The pattern was clear. He had drained my inheritance strategically, hiding behind legality while twisting it in his favor. He hadn't stolen everything in one reckless move. He had done it carefully, intelligently, patiently. The way predators hunt. I could have broken that day. I could have screamed. Instead, I made a decision. I would outgrow him. I would outlearn him. I would outplay him. Through scholarships and relentless focus, I earned my way into spaces he never expected me to enter. Law firms, financial institutions, corporate boardrooms. I didn't tell anyone my full story. I simply studied similar cases. Breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent transfer, abuse of guardianship authority. Every legal precedent was a stepping stone back to him. By 22, I was interning with forensic accountants who traced hidden assets for litigation cases. Quietly, I began mapping his empire. Shell companies linked by subtle patterns. Directors connected through shared addresses. Transfers timed around my birthdays. He thought time would bury the evidence. He didn't know I was digging. By 24, I had enough documentation to see the full picture. The house had been refinanced under his name. My parents' company shares diluted and redistributed to entities he controlled. My trust manipulated under clauses he exploited while I was legally powerless. But he had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated the child he discarded. He believed the orphanage would swallow me. He believed silence meant weakness. He never imagined silence was strategy. On my 25th birthday, the remaining trust assets legally transferred into my control. For the first time since I was 8 years old, I wasn't under anyone's authority. I sat alone that night, staring at the city skyline, holding documents that proved the truth. I didn't feel rage. I felt clarity. Revenge is not loud. It is precise. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment at his corporate headquarters under my full name, Angela Strak. He wouldn't recognize it immediately. Why would he? To him, I was a chapter long closed, a responsibility erased, a child conveniently forgotten. But tomorrow I will walk into his office, not as the girl he abandoned, but as the woman he created through betrayal. He stole my childhood. He rewrote my family's legacy. He buried me alive in paperwork and lies. But he forgot one thing about buried things. Sometimes they grow roots, and roots can crack foundations. The building was taller than I imagined, all glass and steel, reflecting the morning sun like it had nothing to hide. My father once stood in front of cameras, with the same confidence this building projected. Now my uncle did. His name was engraved in silver, letters across the entrance as if history had rewritten itself to erase mine. I stood across the street for a moment, studying it, remembering the night. I watched him on television cutting a ribbon and calling it his achievement. He had no idea the ghost of his past was about to walk through his front doors. I adjusted my blazer, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to feel the weight of who I had become. I wasn't the 8-year-old girl at the orphanage gate anymore. I was 25, educated, prepared, armed with truth. The lobby smelled of polished marble and expensive cologne. Employees moved with purpose, unaware that the empire they worked for had cracks beneath its foundation. I approached the reception desk and gave my name calmly. Angela Strak. I have a scheduled meeting. The receptionist scanned the system and nodded. Yes, Mrs. Strak, he's expecting you. Expecting me. The irony almost made me smile. He thought this was a routine legal consultation, a young corporate attorney requesting partnership advice. He didn't know he was about to meet the consequence of 17 years of deception. The elevator ride felt longer than it was. Each floor lighting up was like a countdown to confrontation. I didn't replay emotional memories. I replayed facts, dates, transfers, signatures, evidence. Is stronger than emotion. The doors opened directly into the executive level. His assistant greeted me with professional, warmth, and led me to a large office framed with glass walls, overlooking the city. And there he was. My uncle stood near the window, hands behind his back, posture confident, hair touched with gray that made him look distinguished. For a split second, I saw the man who used to carry me on his shoulders during family barbecues. Then I remembered the orphanage gate closing behind me. He turned around with a practiced smile. "Ms. Strak, welcome. Please, have a seat." His voice was smooth, rehearsed from years of interviews and negotiations. He didn't recognize me, not yet. I sat across from him and placed my leather folder gently on the table. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice," I said evenly. "Of course. I'm always open to meeting promising professionals. What can I do for you?" Promising professionals. If only he knew. I studied his face closely, searching for guilt, but found none. He believed his story completely. I opened the folder slowly, sliding the first document toward him. "I'd like to discuss a case involving fiduciary mismanagement of a minor's trust." His eyes scanned the page casually at first, then more carefully. The color in his face shifted almost imperceptibly. "Interesting," he said, leaning back. "And how am I involved?" I slid the next document forward. A timeline of transactions dating back 17 years. His signature highlighted in yellow. The room felt smaller. "You were appointed legal guardian of an 8-year-old beneficiary after her parents died in a plane crash." I continued calmly. "Under state law, that made you a fiduciary, bound to act in her best interest." He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. His silence confirmed recognition. I watched it happen, the moment memory connected the dots. His eyes lifted slowly to mine, studying, searching. I held his gaze. No anger, no tears, just certainty. "Angela?" he finally said, barely above a whisper. Hearing my name in his voice after all these years felt like reopening an old scar. "Yes," I replied. "Angela." He stood abruptly, as if movement could regain control of the room. "This is unexpected," he said, forcing a tight smile. "I didn't realize you were pursuing law. I didn't respond to the attempt at small talk." I placed another document on the table. Property transfer deeds moving my parents' house into one of his shell corporations. Then bank statements showing structured withdrawals. Then corporate restructuring filings. Each page was a quiet accusation. His composure began to crack at the edges. "You don't understand how complicated things were back then," he said, voice firm but defensive. "Your parents left financial instability. I had to protect the company." I almost admired the consistency of his lie. "The forensic audits say otherwise," I replied. The company was solvent, profitable, growth. Projections were positive 6 months before the crash. He stopped pacing. His eyes hardened slightly. "What exactly do you want, Angela?" There it was. Not apology. Not remorse. Negotiation. Always business. I closed the folder gently and folded my hands. "What I want is simple. Full restitution of transferred assets, reversal of fraudulent conveyances, and public acknowledgement of breach of fiduciary duty." The word sounded clinical, controlled. He let out a short laugh. But there was no humor in it. "You think you can walk in here and threaten me?" "I built this company." "You inherited it," I corrected softly. "From me." The silence that followed was heavy. He studied me as if trying to measure how dangerous I truly was. "You have no idea what legal battles cost," he warned. "Years, millions, reputation." I leaned forward slightly. "I know exactly what they cost. I've already prepared the filings." His jaw tightened. I continued before he could interrupt. "Civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty. Petition for constructive trust over misappropriated assets. Motion to freeze accounts pending litigation. I've also scheduled a meeting with investigative journalists." That made him still, completely still. The polished businessman mask began slipping, revealing something sharper underneath. "You wouldn't dare," he said quietly. I held his gaze without blinking. "You left me in an orphanage and drove away in my father's car. Dare is something I learned very young." For the first time I saw it. Not guilt, fear, not of prison, not of fines, but of exposure. His empire wasn't built only on money. It was built on reputation, awards, interviews, charity galas. The image of a self-made savior, and I was the evidence that image was a lie. He returned slowly to his chair, exhaling through his nose. "What's your timeline?" he asked. "Negotiation again." I stood gathering my documents. "You have 7 days," I said calmly. "After that, it becomes public record." I walked toward the door without waiting for dismissal. My hand touched the handle before he spoke again. "Angela?" I paused but didn't turn around. His voice was different now, less polished. "You could have called." I finally looked back at him. "You could have visited." And then I walked out, leaving him alone in the glass office built on stolen foundations. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time in 17 years, I felt the balance shift. The orphan had returned, and the mask had begun to slip. 7 days, that's how long I gave him. Not because I was merciful, but because I wanted him to feel time the way I once did. Slow, suffocating, heavy with uncertainty. I knew he wouldn't sleep. Men like him never fear confrontation. They fear exposure. And exposure was now ticking like a clock above his empire. I didn't wait idly. The moment I left his building, I activated everything I had prepared. Legal filings were finalized and queued. Financial injunction requests were ready to be submitted the second the deadline expired. Investigative journalists had encrypted copies of preliminary documents with instructions to publish if triggered. This wasn't emotion. It was architecture, a carefully designed collapse. On the second day, his legal team reached out, polite, strategic. They requested clarification, additional documentation, a private resolution meeting. I declined. Everything would be formal. Everything would be recorded. I had lived too long in informal promises that dissolved into abandonment. On the third day, financial pressure began quietly. One of his subsidiary accounts attempted to transfer a significant amount offshore. Unfortunately for him, I had anticipated that move. My forensic accountant filed an emergency notice citing suspicious liquidation, patterns tied to pending litigation. The transaction froze mid-process. I imagined the panic in his conference room when that notification appeared. The empire was no longer obedient. By the fourth day, rumors started circulating in his company. Senior executives sensed tension. Emergency board meetings were scheduled. I received an anonymous message from one of the directors requesting a confidential conversation. Fear spreads faster than truth, and fear had entered his walls. On the 5th day, he called me directly. I let it ring twice before answering. "Angela," he began, skipping formalities. His voice sounded strained, thinner than before. "We can settle this privately. There's no need to damage everything your father built." He said my father, like it, was a shared possession. "My father built integrity," I replied calmly. "You built leverage." Silence stretched between us. "What do you want?" he asked again, but this time it wasn't negotiation. It was calculation mixed with desperation. "Restoration," I said. "Not revenge, restoration." He exhaled sharply. "You think courts will simply hand you everything?" "No," I answered. "Courts respond to evidence, and I have 17 years of it." He didn't threaten me this time. He didn't laugh. He simply said, "You've changed." I almost smiled. "You made sure of that." I ended the call. On the 6th day, the first visible crack appeared. A financial blog published. A subtle article questioning irregular restructuring patterns in his early leadership years. It didn't mention me. It didn't accuse directly. It simply asked questions. Markets don't collapse from accusations. They collapse from doubt. Stock prices dipped slightly. Investors began requesting clarification. His public relations team released a generic statement about routine audits and transparency. Commitments. The irony was almost poetic. On the 7th day, at exactly 9 a.m., my legal team filed the suit. Breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent conveyance, unjust enrichment, petition for constructive trust, motion for asset freeze. The courthouse clerk stamped the documents without emotion, unaware she had just triggered the unraveling of a carefully curated legacy. By noon, journalists had the full story. By evening, headlines were no longer subtle. Business leader accused of misusing orphan's trust. Orphan. The word followed his name like a shadow. He had spent years polishing his image as a rescuer of community projects, a sponsor of children's charities, a mentor to young entrepreneurs. Now the narrative was shifting. Cameras returned to the building I had walked into days earlier. This time, they weren't there to celebrate. They were there to question. He appeared once, briefly, flanked by lawyers, offering a composed denial. "These claims are baseless and will be addressed in court," he said. But I saw it again, that flicker in his eyes. Not anger, instability. His board of directors announced an internal review. 2 major investors temporarily suspended funding pending investigation. Charity partners quietly distanced themselves. Reputation is fragile when built on borrowed truth. That night, I drove past my childhood home. The gates were closed, but lights were on inside. For years, I imagined reclaiming it would feel triumphant. Instead, it felt solemn. Houses hold memories, and mine had been occupied by betrayal. My phone buzzed with notifications, messages of support from strangers, interview requests, legal updates. I ignored them all. This was never about public applause. It was about balance. The following morning, his lead attorney requested mediation. Not to dismiss the case, to negotiate surrender. They proposed asset reallocation, financial compensation, shared control of remaining corporate shares. I rejected shared control. I would not co-own anything with the man who signed me into abandonment. By the third day of litigation, the court approved preliminary asset freezes pending investigation. Bank accounts were restricted. Property sales halted. Executive bonuses suspended. His empire was still standing, but immobile. Pressure does not destroy immediately. It destabilizes first. He requested to meet me again, this time not in his office, in a neutral conference room with legal counsel present. I agreed. When he entered, he looked older. Not physically, but structurally, like something inside him had shifted under weight. We didn't exchange pleasantries. Documents were presented, settlement terms outlined, full transfer of misappropriated properties, liquidation of specific holdings to reimburse diverted funds with interest, formal resignation from executive position pending trial outcome, public statement acknowledging mismanagement without direct admission of intent. He hesitated at the resignation clause. His entire identity was fused with that title. Without it, he was just a man who once left a child behind iron gates. "If I sign this," he said quietly, "it destroys everything." I looked at him steadily. "No," I replied. "You did that 17 years ago." The room was silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. His hand hovered over the pen. Pride wrestled with survival. Finally, slowly, he signed. One signature, the same motion that once sealed my exile, now initiated his fall. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no tears. Just ink settling into paper. Legally binding. Irreversible. As I walked out of that building for the second time, cameras flashed again. This time I didn't stop. I didn't need statements. The documents would speak. The court would finalize. The world would interpret. And somewhere inside that glass tower, a man who believed he had buried his mistake was finally facing it. Empires don't collapse in explosions. They crack under truth, and his had begun to crumble. The final court date arrived without thunder or spectacle. There were no dramatic storms outside, no cinematic music swelling in the background, just a quiet morning and a courtroom, filled with people pretending this was just another legal proceeding. But for me, it was the closing of a 17-year wound. I sat upright, composed, dressed not in anger but in certainty. Across the room, my uncle avoided my eyes. The man who once moved through boardrooms like a king now sat behind his attorneys, smaller somehow, diminished not by age but by exposure. The evidence had been reviewed. The forensic audits confirmed asset diversion. The breach of fiduciary duty was undeniable. His signed settlement had already transferred the majority of properties and financial holdings back under my legal control. But the court's ruling would make it permanent, public, historical. When the judge began speaking, the room fell into absolute silence. Each word felt deliberate, measured, irreversible. The court acknowledged the abuse of guardianship authority, the unlawful restructuring of protected trust assets, the calculated misrepresentation of financial conditions. And then came the final order, full restitution upheld. Executive disqualification from fiduciary roles for 10 years. Formal record of breach entered into public registry. It wasn't prison. It wasn't handcuffs. It was something far worse for a man like him. It was disgrace. The kind that lingers in headlines and whispers at charity galas. The kind that follows you into every room long after the cameras leave. When the gavel struck, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. 17 years of silence dissolved in a single sound. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited again. Microphones stretched forward like accusations. "Angela, how does it feel to win?" one of them asked. I paused for a moment, letting the word settle. Win. This had never been a game. "It feels like balance," I answered calmly. Nothing more. I walked past them without elaborating. Revenge had never been about spectacle. It was about restoration. The following weeks were filled with transitions. Legal ownership of my childhood home was reinstated. Corporate shares were restructured under ethical oversight. Board members, who had quietly enabled his decisions, resigned before they could be questioned. The company that once carried only his name was restored to its original identity, my father's legacy, reclaimed not through emotion, but through law. The day I walked back into my childhood house as its rightful owner, the air felt different. Dust particles floated in beams of afternoon sunlight. The walls still held faint imprints of frames that once displayed family photographs. I moved slowly through each room, touching surfaces gently, not as someone conquering territory, but as someone returning home after exile. In my old bedroom, I stood by the window where I used to watch for my parents' car to pull into the driveway. For years, I imagined this moment filled with dramatic satisfaction. Instead, it was quiet. Healing is quiet. I didn't erase every trace of the years he lived there. I didn't need to. The house no longer symbolized theft. It symbolized endurance. His resignation from the company sent shockwaves through the business community. Sponsors withdrew awards previously given to him. Articles were rewritten. Biographies updated. The narrative corrected itself. He disappeared from public view shortly after. No interviews. No statements. Just absence. I thought I would want to see him broken. But the truth is, watching someone face the consequences of their own choices is not satisfying, it's sobering. One evening, weeks after the ruling, I received a letter. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Inside was a single page. No excuses, no elaborate defense. Just a short acknowledgement that he had convinced himself he deserved everything because he believed he had saved the company. Power had justified betrayal in his mind. The final line read, "I underestimated you." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He hadn't underestimated me. He had underestimated consequence. As months passed, I redirected part of my restored inheritance into something deliberate. I funded legal advocacy programs for minors in guardianship systems. I established oversight grants to prevent fiduciary abuse. I didn't do it publicly at first. I did it structurally, because there are children sitting in rooms right now, listening to adults discuss their futures as if they aren't present. I know what that feels like, and I know what it costs. My name began appearing in business publications. Not as a victim, not as a scandal, but as a reform advocate and strategic investor. Interviews asked about resilience, about justice, about empowerment. I answered carefully every time. Pain can either define you or refine you, I would say. You decide which. The company stabilized under new leadership. Ethical transparency reports became mandatory. Financial audits were published annually. The empire that once hid behind manipulation now stood on accountability. Sometimes, late at night, I sit in the living room of the house that was taken from me and think about the 8-year-old girl standing at the orphanage gate. If I could speak to her now, I wouldn't promise revenge. I would promise strength, because revenge fades once it's complete. But strength stays. I didn't destroy him. I revealed him. And in doing so, I rebuilt myself. My name is Angela Strak. At 8 years old, I lost my parents in a plane crash and was left with nothing but silence. At 25, I walked back into the life that was stolen from me. Not with anger, but with evidence. He thought abandoning me would erase me. Instead, it forged me. And if there's one thing this story proves, it's this: never underestimate the quiet child watching from the corner of the room. One day, she might return with the power to rewrite everything. If this story moved you, if you believe justice should always find its way back home, then please subscribe to my channel for more dramatic, emotional stories of betrayal, resilience, and revenge.